So just for something a little bit festive, I came across this image on Pixabay. I make sure you've got the link, so if you want to paint along with me, either by looking at the image on your browser, if you're looking at it online, or if you want to print it like I have. So there's a couple of ways that we can begin this. Is one of the first things you want to do is you can either cover the back of the image with some pencil and then sort of do a trace over it, or you can do what I'm going to do and just do a very quick basic sketch. So as I say each time whenever we're doing these, is you want to be darting your gaze backwards and forwards between the reference photo and the surface that you're working on. I'm working on mixed media paper, but watercolour paper will also work very well for this. And what I'm doing is I'm just putting in some basic lines. I'm not sort of doing anything too specific, I'm just working on the basic shapes here. I'm also looking at the gaps between, the spaces between, so sort of the space between here and here. So I've got an idea on where some of the green sort of ferns are going to be. So always have a look at the areas between things, as this will help you to get perspective when you're sort of drawing and painting. And what we're going to do is, for these sort of white snowflakes that are on the glass, we're going to leave those areas blank on the page. So we're effectively going to be painting around these, and then we're going to put these in with pen at the end. Alright, so when you've got your basic sketch, which is what I've got here, very basic, this is your starting point. So what you'll want to do is have some watercolours. This is a watercolour pan set and a brush. You can use any type of sort of round head brush, I recommend. So one of the ones I've got here is a size 8. This works very well. And you'll want some water, and then I'll show you how we get started. Okay, so looking at the reference, I'm going to start putting in some of the liquid. So I'm going to just go into a little bit of water, which I've got here, a little bit of water on my brush. You don't need a lot, and I'm going to go in. The best thing to do when you're working with watercolour is to work lighter than you need. You can always build up colour, and as you can see, what I'm doing is I'm just putting on a little bit of colour, and then I'm just going to move it around using the water. So I've not actually put a great deal here, but I'm also looking for where these snowflakes are, so I'm going to leave those areas white and just sort of paint around them, so to speak. I'm just going to move my water over here. As I always say, you want to work backwards and forwards, looking at the reference all the time. Don't worry if you make a mistake, you can always correct things. So mine's very light at the moment. One of the other things to remember when you're using watercolour is it will dry much lighter. So as you get more confident with some of the sort of tones of colour that you're creating, you'll add a little bit more paint each time. And as I said, if you do add something you think, oh, that's the wrong colour, or that's too dark, what you can do is you can just go into your water and dilute it. Alright, so I haven't got this exact, just sort of doing the idea of it at the moment. Right, we can see from the image here that this bit here is darker. So So I'm going to go in with a little bit more, just to add another tone of colour. I'm doing it very lightly as well. As I said, what you're going to do is you're going to put in those finer details of the snowflakes with pen. We're going to do that later on. So whilst this is drying, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in some of the other colours. So I'm going to look at the red that this glass mug is sat on. So I'm just going to put this in. And this is what we call the wet in dry technique. And this is basically where you're using your wet paint on a dry surface. And I'm literally just going to follow this around. Again, I'm looking at the reference all the time, darting my gaze backwards and forwards constantly. Just building this up slowly. And you'll notice also what I'm doing is often I'm sort of adding a very small amount of paint, and then I'm just using the water to move and manipulate that paint around a little bit. Okay, I'm going to do the same with the ferns over here, so let's go into some green. And I'm going to stipple. So this is a really, really good effect that I really recommend you use and experiment with, because it's a wonderful way of getting colour in quite quickly as well. So it takes away that fear of sort of making the wrong mark or putting paint in the wrong place, because you're literally just stippling and putting paint in. And it works very well when you're doing any type of painting that involves sort of leaves, trees, flowers, anything that's sort of more botanical works really, really well. So we're just going to build this up. Then over here, on this side, we've got some material. So I'm going to go in with a blue for this. So even though it's sort of more of a grey, I'm just doing a little bit of blue, and then I'm going to use the water. So this is a tiny, tiny amount of paint, and then I'm just going to use water here just to fade that out. So again, what we're doing here, where we're adding sort of paint near one particular end, and then we're fading it out with water. This is a gradient. All right. So starting to take shape now. I'm just going to add some more of that colour just to the top of the glass, because it's not completely sort of white or clear. So I'm just going to add a little bit. Not a lot, just a bit, like so. And then I'm just going to add a little bit more red at the back here where you can see through the glass. I'm going to do a little bit, and that's all I'm going to do. I'm then going to wash out my brush, just test it. One of the things you might see some artists do is we often will test the amount of water we've got on our brush, on our skin, just so that we know if it's going to be you know, sort of dripping with water, or if it's going to be just moist enough. So I'm just taking off some of the excess, and I'm literally just going to use the dampness of the brush just to move this paint around a bit, fade it out, and carry it over here. Okay, so that's everything in terms of paint. what we're going to do is we're going to let this dry, and then I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to show you how you can add finer details with some pen. Okay, so now that this is dried, I'm going to go into this with just an ordinary handwriting pen, which looks a little bit like this. You can also use a ballpoint pen. You could also use a pencil if you prefer, but pen works really, really well on top of watercolour, particularly when you're just starting out with watercolour. You're getting used to it, you're starting to sort of mix colours a bit, you're trying out the techniques. So once you've got all of your main colour in, as you can see here, you can then go in with something a bit more defined, like a pen or a pencil, and add in your detail. So one of the things I really do recommend is that you have your reference photo in line. So I'm just going to have mine just above my mixed media paper I'm working on. You want to have it in line with the surface you're working on, because often what you'll find is if you have it slightly sort of tilted, it can make you sort of draw or paint things in the slightly wrong angle. So that's a little tip. So just looking at the detail of the cup now, I'm going to start to draw in some of that detail. As I said, don't worry about sort of making any mistakes. Try and zoom this out a little bit. There we go. So what this will do is this will help to redefine some of the detail. And gives you a little bit more control. As I said, that's particularly useful when you're sort of new to creating art, and if you're new to using a medium like watercolour. So again, as I said, one of the other things you will want to do is to keep darting your gaze backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. So what I'm doing is wherever I'm starting, so I always start at the top and work down, is always dart your gaze backwards and forwards between wherever you are particularly working on at that point. So if you're working on the rim of the cup, for example, then keep darting your gaze backwards and forwards between here and here constantly. And if you do this, this will help you to get perspective, because often when we are working on pieces of artwork and we're sort of drawing or sketching, we're often sort of sometimes creating pieces for quite some time, and you can lose perspective quite easily. So just by sort of darting your gaze backwards and forwards really helps you to keep that. What I'm doing now is doing quite a sketchy impression of some of the sort of snowflakes. Just working this around. Again, I'm darting my gaze backwards and forwards as I do this. I'm working very quickly as well. I do actually recommend this, because what this does is this helps you to get over the hurdle of putting a mark in the wrong place or making a mistake, because often we get so worried about getting something right that we kind of don't really get started. So I really do recommend working quickly, because then you are sort of making those decisions, and if you do happen to make a mistake, you can learn how to hide mistakes, how to change things. So I'm working in quite a sort of sketchy, loose, scratchy sort of way. I'm not being too specific. So as I said, if you want to use a pen, if you want to use a pencil, I'm also looking at some of the shade here, so I'm just going to make that a little bit darker, like so, and I'm going to outline this material here as well. in some of the creases that we can see, like so. Again, just constantly be looking at that reference photo, constantly sort of checking things. It really does help with your confidence as well. The more you sort of experiment and try new things, and if you work quickly or you're using a medium that you haven't sort of used before, you will get more confident with it. So as you can see, I'm using this quite roughly. I'm not being specific. I'm sort of just sketching the idea of this. So we've got a basic shape, we've got our basic colour, basic sort of tones in here now. Very, very basic there, like that. Alright, so there we go. A very basic version of this. Just to show you that you don't have to be too exact, to be too specific. You can still get the basics in, you can still get your basic colours in, and then you can finalise the detail with something like pen.